All right, welcome everyone. I'm Allison Mazie, president of the Kansas Association of Broadcasters. I would also, in addition to welcoming our Kansas broadcasters on the call, I know our friends in Minnesota were also invited to attend this EEO webinar. So hello to any of you who have joined us. I'm going to intro our speaker today, which most of you know. He is KAB's Hotline FCC attorney, David Oxenford. He's a broadcast and digital media law attorney representing clients in Washington, D.C. for over 35 years. And of course, he is our expert on all things FCC. So I'm going to turn it over to David. If anyone has questions, you should have access to a Q&A chat box. Please go ahead and submit there, and I'll keep an eye on it throughout our webinar today, and we will address them as we go. But I'm going to go dark so David can get started. Thanks, David.
And thank you, Allison, for the introduction. Thank you for putting this together. And Wendy from Minnesota, thank you for helping recruit some of your members to listen into our presentation on EEO this afternoon. It's just going to be a review of the FCC's EEO rules, how to basically keep yourself out of trouble with the FCC on EEO matters. We're going to be discussing general obligations under the FCC rules. Obviously, I can't, this is not legal advice. You need to talk about specific situations that may arise at your station with your own station's attorneys, because facts can really make a difference in analyzing any EEO rule. But I'm going to go over generally what those obligations are so that you've got a good idea of what you should be doing at your station. If you hear things as I'm talking today that just sound completely foreign, oh my goodness, we're not doing that at our station, that's when you give your attorney a call and start saying, how can we make sure that we're in compliance with the FCC's obligations? Because the FCC is reviewing EEO performance for broadcasters just as much as they ever did. In fact, in some cases, probably more than they ever did. Recently, actually not so recently anymore, about 2.5 years ago, there is a new head of the EEO office at the FCC. And prior to that, there had been a guy who had been around for 20 or 25 years, and everybody had kind of gotten used to his style, and there wasn't a whole lot of EEO enforcement going on. The current EEO branch seems to be more concerned about what's going on. They seem to be asking more questions about EEO filings with license renewals, for instance. There seems to be more enforcement going on in the EEO area. So it is an area in which you need to pay attention. Now, obviously, the FCC requires a couple of different things, including that you don't discriminate on a most basic level, that you don't discriminate against people in your hiring or your employment practices based on race, based on gender, based on ethnic origins, based on age, based on any other protected classes that may exist in your state. Any finding of discrimination against anybody in one of those protected classes can come back and haunt you. And that's a finding not by the FCC, but a finding by a state employment commission or by the federal EEOC or by any other employment agency. If there's a finding that you did something wrong in your hiring or employment practices, you have to report that to the FCC, and that can end up counting against you at license renewal time or other times at which the FCC looks at EEO matters. But beyond just the general obligation that all stations and really all businesses have not to discriminate in their hiring and employment practices, the FCC imposes an additional set of obligations, and obligations that are essentially affirmative action obligations. And there are affirmative action obligations that require that you reach out to all groups within your community to make sure that they're aware of employment opportunities at your stations. They're aware of job openings at your stations. And not only that, even when you don't have job openings, and certainly when you do, you also have to go one step beyond just publicizing the existence of those job openings. But you've got to educate your community about how to get a broadcast job, what kind of training to have for a broadcast job, what those jobs are at a broadcast station, and train your employees to take more senior, advanced positions at your stations to help them better advance in their careers in broadcasting. That's what's the supplemental efforts. We'll talk about the FCC's three-pronged affirmative action requirement in great detail in just a couple of slides. So we'll come back to that. And then once you do these outreach efforts that the FCC requires, there's also, as probably with everything in the government, paperwork requirements that accompany that. So you'll need to make sure that you're keeping the required paperwork. We'll talk in detail about that in a few moments. As Allison said, for those of you who've joined late, if you want to ask any questions as I go through these requirements, use the Q&A box, and I'll try to keep my eyes on that as well as on the slides as we're going through and answer your questions as we get to those areas. Before we get to the specifics, just a couple of general thoughts about EEO. Clearly over the last couple of years in particular, there have been a lot of important discussions throughout society about race, inclusiveness, diversity, and the need to bring all groups within a community together and to allow them to advance in employment and other opportunities on an equal basis. The FCC, like every other government agency, is looking at how they can do their part to advance these goals of diversity and inclusiveness in hiring and in other activities that they regulate. So the FCC has been looking at further revisions to these EEO policies that really have been pretty much unchanged for the last 20 years to see if there is additional obligations that they should put on broadcasters or other folks that they regulate to get a more diverse workforce, to make sure there are equal opportunities throughout the workforce. The one proceeding that is asking whether the FCC should be doing more about that started about 4 or 5 years ago. It was a very general proceeding. It's likely to have more questions and comments, and a further notice of proposed rulemaking asking for comments on specific proposals will be advanced and made public before any rules can be adopted, because the original proceeding was just so general that the FCC likely can't adopt new rules based on the comments that were filed in that original proceeding. The FCC is looking at some more detailed reporting requirements, including bringing back what's called the FCC Form 395 for broadcasters, the Form 395B. That was a form done away with over 20 years ago that required every broadcaster to basically categorize all of their employees by race, ethnicity, gender, and position at the station, whether they were managers, whether they're on-air personnel, whether they're sales personnel, whether they were technical personnel, whether they were clerical personnel, whether they were filling some other role at the station, and then break them down by race and gender and ethnicity. These reports were thrown out in the early 2000s because a court thought that they were being used by the FCC for purposes of penalizing stations that didn't meet some sort of quota. If the numbers within your workforce didn't somehow mirror what was the diversity index within your community, then the FCC would require additional actions from the broadcaster to show how they were meeting the EEO obligations the courts back in the early 2000s said, hey, that's putting a quota, making broadcasters hire based on race, gender, ethnicity, to meet those quotas, not based on getting the best person for a broadcast position, and threw those rules out. Since then, the FCC has been trying to bring back that Form 395, if nothing else, but to get a snapshot of what the workforce in the broadcast industry looks like, to see if the FCC should be doing more to encourage a diverse workforce. But they haven't figured out a way to bring that form back and not allow it to be used for enforcement purposes, to try to somehow get anonymity with the information that's being reported so it can't be used by the FCC for enforcement purposes, but still make sure that all the broadcasters file it and are accurate in their filings. And having it not be public makes it difficult for the FCC to enforce the obligation that each broadcaster file it. So they've been wrestling with that for over 25 years, or over 20 years. This commission is still looking at bringing that back and has said that that's a priority, but we haven't seen much more detail, and may not, as long as we have a FCC that has 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats on it. There's also a proposal that was advanced last year that would encourage reporting or require reporting about employment, not only from broadcasters, but also from broadcast suppliers, including programmers and syndicators who produce the programming that's run on broadcast station. That was just a proposal that was advanced by a couple of minority advocacy groups. It hasn't gone any place other than some initial comments. There's not a formal proposal to adopt that that's been advanced by the FCC, but it's just important to know that that's out there, because it shows that EEO is still on the agenda of many groups in Washington who are talking to the FCC about what they should be doing. Obviously, the industry itself has been looking at EEO efforts that it should be making. The NAB and most broadcast associations have been running sessions about diversity and how to encourage a diverse workforce at your broadcast station, how to foster a diverse workforce at your broadcast station and why that's important, and doing other activities to train broadcasters to bring new people into their workforces. Congress has, been looking at EEO issues as well. In the last session of Congress, there was a proposal to bring back what's called the minority tax certificate. That basically was a policy that was in place until the mid-90s and probably did more to bring minorities into broadcast ownership than any other policy that's ever been in place. That allowed a broadcast seller to defer the gains on the sale of a broadcast station if they rolled those gains over into another broadcast property or stock of a broadcast company within a given period of time, and if they sold to a company that was controlled by minority owners. That, if you've got 2 people that are giving essentially the same bid, but you get a tax deferral if you sell to a minority, that encourages you as a seller of a broadcast property to favor that bid from the minority owner. And a number of stations were sold to minorities based on that tax certificate. It was ultimately done away with in the mid-90s by Congress when a company headed by a minority went to buy a large cable system where the government would have had to have passed up hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes if that minority tax certificate had applied to that cable transaction. So Congress just repealed the whole program entirely. The idea now is to bring it back, but limit it to smaller properties where new entrants are more likely to be buying their first stations. We'll see where that goes. It was adopted in committee by by one of the congressional committees last year, but never made it to the floor, never made it to the other body in Congress. Whether it will be reintroduced in this session of Congress, we're still waiting to see. Again, before jumping into the details of all the FCC's EEO rules, the other question that I get a lot is, well, did the pandemic change anything? Did that change the way that EEO was enforced? And really, it did not. During the pandemic, the FCC was still doing audits of stations' EEO performance. They were still pulling renewals out of line to ask more questions about stations' EEO performances. They were giving fines for paperwork issues where stations did not do all the paperwork required under the EEO rules. They did have one pandemic related decision that basically said if you laid somebody off because of the pandemic, you could bring them back within 9 months without doing any sort of wide dissemination about the opportunity, the job opening at your station. That effective date of that, while it hasn't officially passed, practically you're not laying people off based on pandemic-related reasons anymore. So that policy probably has no effect anymore. Otherwise, generally the rules, with very few exceptions that we will highlight one or two that have occurred recently, but generally they're the same rules that have been placed for 20 years. So most of you who have been around should be familiar with these rules. But I'm always shocked how many broadcasters don't know some of the details about the EEO rules, and also about how much change there is at broadcast stations, and people who are in charge of hiring an EEO documentation are often changing so that they haven't had the opportunity to review these rules in the past. So let's talk about some of the specifics about the FCC's EEO rules. And again, if you've got questions about anything, please use the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring that for questions about the issues that I'm talking about. So first, who needs to worry about these FCC EEO rules? As I said at the beginning, the non-discrimination rules, that you don't discriminate in any of your hiring practices. If you're found to have discriminated by any sort of employment agency, government employment agency, EEO commission, employment commission within your state or within the federal government, that can affect your license. So make sure you're not discriminating, not only in hiring, but also in all of your employment practices. But then again, the FCC has got this affirmative action outreach requirement. But that applies only to station employment units that have 5 or more full-time employees. For the FCC, a full-time employee is one that works 30 hours or more per week. And an employment unit is not just a single station, but it's any number of commonly controlled stations that are operating in the same general geographic area and share at least one employee. So they share a general manager, they share a sales manager, they share a clerical employee, and they're serving the same general geographic area and under common control. They're all part of the same employment unit. And if that employment unit has 5 or more full-time employees, you have these affirmative outreach efforts. So be aware of those. These rules apply both to commercial and non-commercial stations. There is some special caveats for religious broadcasters. Your outreach can be among those of the same faith. If you're a faith-based station where you have certain job categories, or where all your job categories at your station need to have this faith-based orientation, the obligations to do the wide dissemination, the outreach, all these EEO obligations are among those of the same faith. But you still have these same EEO obligations once you have 5 or more full-time employees at your station employment unit. Somebody asked the question about whether the FCC has ever looked back at this 20-year-old set of EEO rules to see whether they've really helped change the workforce in the broadcast industry. And I don't know that there's ever been a systematic study of broadcast employment to see whether it has changed the face of the broadcasting industry. I think many of us, just from what we see on TV, what we hear on the radio, figure that it has made changes, whether it's these particular rules or whether it's changes in society generally, or whether it's some of the enforcement that went on prior to these rules that made those changes. Who knows? But certainly there have been changes over the years, and have there been cases where broadcasters have actually discriminated? Not many, but occasionally you do see situations where there have been findings of employment discrimination, and probably one or two cases that I can think of where there were substantial issues about whether there was real discrimination taking place. Really, those cases mostly predated the current rules, and were probably predated the turn of the century. Um, so you certainly don't see that often now, but still the FCC's obligation to do this outreach is required. So when does the FCC look at all this outreach that we'll start talking about here on the next slide? Several different times. They do random audits of 5% of all stations every year. And that means if one station within your employment unit gets hit by an audit notice, all of the stations within your employment unit are reporting on their EEO outreach efforts, because you're reporting based on employment unit, not based on your single station. At license renewal time, the FCC looks at EEO. They do a midterm review. So 4 years after you filed your license renewal, the FCC will be looking at performance again for all TV stations and for radio employment units with more than 10 full-time employees. And the FCC no longer has a special forum for that midterm report. It used to be that there was a special form that you filed. Now they'll just go to your online public file, look at your annual employment reports. We'll talk about them in more specificity in a few moments, but they'll look at those annual employment reports, see what you've reported, and see whether there are questions that are raised by those reports. That review for radio in Minnesota will take place in December of 2024. And for Kansas radio, it will start in February of 2025. TV is 1 year later, so December 2025 for Minnesota, and February 2026 for TV stations in Kansas. So the FCC will be looking to see whether you've done all the required outreach and whether you've documented that properly in these midterm reviews. The FCC can also trigger a review based on a complaint. And I've seen situations where somebody didn't get a job they thought they were qualified for at a broadcast station, or they got fired by a broadcast station and turned in their former employer, saying that they're not doing what they are supposed to be doing in the employment outreach area, and the FCC has asked for more investigation. I noted earlier that the FCC does seem in the last couple of years to be looking at more and more applications for their EEO reports, especially license renewal applications. One of the reasons may be that EEO was moved from the Media Bureau that processes most broadcast applications, moved over into the Enforcement Bureau. The Enforcement Bureau's reason for being is to enforce the FCC's rules. They tend to be more enforcement oriented. Their reason for being is to enforce those rules, so you tend to see more aggressive activity out of an Enforcement Bureau employee than you do from the Media Bureau. And I think that's resulted in enhanced EEO enforcement from the Media Bureau. And every year we'll see at least a couple of EEO fines based on not meeting some of the obligations. So let's start now to talk about the specifics of those EEO obligations. We just talked about who's required to do it. We talked about when the FCC reviews these requirements. Now let's talk about what those requirements actually are. So as I said, it's a three-pronged EEO outreach requirement, an affirmative action requirement for broadcasters. The first prong is that you, as they say, shout it from the mountaintops. When you've got a job opening, you let the world know that you've got a job opening. The FCC is looking for you to reach out to all groups within your communities to bring in new people into the broadcast industry, to make sure that all groups within your community find out about opportunities for employment at your station, that you're doing some sort of publicity that reaches all the groups within your community so that the recruiting is outside that old boys network. It's not just in-house referrals. It's not just people already in the broadcast industry that are applying for broadcast jobs, but you're bringing new blood into the broadcast industry. In the past, the FCC, more than 20 years ago, had focused solely on minority and gender-based hiring. Now it's an outreach not specifically based on minorities and women, but instead aimed at all community groups within your service area. In the past, the outreach had to be done through physically or actually reaching out in the real world to all the groups within your community or a representative sample. Now the FCC has recognized that a lot of recruiting can be online. So they've said that online recruiting can be used. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's got to reach all the groups within your community. So this wide dissemination, letting your community groups all know when you've got a job opening is a requirement for all full-time job openings. The only exception that the FCC has is what's called an exigent circumstance. And we'll talk about that on the next slide, what that means. But it's a very, very limited situation. Generally, all job openings need some sort of outreach obligations or outreach activities. You need to notify the entire community. You need to reach out to your community in a way that will reach everybody within that community using a source or sources that's generally going to be paid attention to by anybody who's looking for a job within your community, not something that's so narrowly tailored that it will shut out certain groups within your community. Now, what is that community within which you're supposed to be recruiting? It's basically one that you can reasonably define both by looking at the service area of your station. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to get people from well outside the service area who can't even see your TV station or hear your radio station who are going to want to come work for that station. It's also unlikely, especially for a smaller station, that you're going to be recruiting people from far away, even if you've got a relatively big signal. If you're a AM station on one side of the Kansas City market, it's probably unlikely that somebody's going to drive all the way across from one side of the Kansas City market to the other side of Kansas City to work at a small station on the other side of the market, especially if all the other employers in the area where your studios are located are not recruiting throughout the metro area, but are focused more on a smaller area. Look at where people are being hired from for jobs in the area where you're operating. Look at your service area and figure out who would be interested in those jobs and make a reasonable determination. It's not going to be limited to people within 12 city blocks or 2 miles or anything like that. It's got to be reasonable, but it doesn't have to be a 100-mile radius. Concentrate on where you're likely to get real employees to work at your station. Again, the idea is recruit from outside the old boys network of word of mouth recruits, suggestions from consultants, referrals from your corporate parent. You're trying to bring in new people into the broadcast industry. That's really what the FCC's EEO rules are all about. And what are they looking at when they are looking at whether your wide dissemination has been successful? They're looking at the people that you actually interview for job openings and the people that you hire for job openings, finding out how they heard about those job openings, um, and whether those sources are ones that are likely bringing in people from outside that old boys network. If all of the people that you're interviewing and all of the people that you're hiring are coming from referrals from your corporate parent, from consultants, from word of mouth from your existing employees, the FCC is going to have questions about whether your wide dissemination is really working. You're going to need to expand the outreach efforts that you're using to make sure that you're really bringing in people from throughout the community. As I said, there's very limited exceptions to the requirement that you let the world know when you've got a job opening at your broadcast station. The exigent circumstance, I love the way that rolls off the tongue, right? Exigent circumstance. What does that mean? It's got to be really something special. It's really got to be something that's important, where you got to go out and hire somebody, and there's just it doesn't make sense to go out and recruit. The one example that the FCC has given where an exigent circumstance really would apply is if you find somebody who is super, who is looking for a job opening, and you don't have, or looking for a job and where you don't have a job opening, but that person has got such great qualifications that you want to make a job opening and hire that individual. And it's a vacancy that you create for the individual, not a vacancy that's already been out there that you just fill with somebody that you want to. So the typical situation would be the anchor person at the competing TV station across the market. Their contract runs out. That person has been in the market forever. They've got a huge profile. Their contract is ended. If you bring them over to your station to anchor the 6 o'clock news, that person's going to increase your ratings points by a couple of points. You're going to hire that person, not because you've got a job opening, not because you've decided to fire one of your existing people already or one of them has already quit, but because this person has got such a reputation in the market, you want to bring them over to your station and put them on your facility. Or that super salesperson at a competing station who knows everybody within the community and just brings in advertising revenue from all sorts of businesses around the community that somehow your salespeople just can't seem to approach. And that salesperson you hear has a row with their employer, and are dissatisfied with their current employment position, you might want to bring on that person. And again, if you're creating the vacancy for that person, that's an exigent circumstance. But if you've got an opening, even if you've got to fill that opening quickly, you should still do some recruiting. One example that comes up from time to time is, hey, the traffic manager just decided that he or she's going to quit. Somebody's got to do my logs. I got to get the traffic system up and working, and that person is the only person who knew how to do it at our station. Well, generally that's not going to be the case, that person is the only person that knows how to work the traffic system, because, hey, that person's going to occasionally be on vacation, right? They're occasionally going to be sick, and somebody has filled in for them when they're on vacation or sick. If you have a position that suddenly becomes vacant, that you're in a rush to fill, if somebody else has filled in for that person in the past, have them fill in for a couple of weeks while you do at least some recruiting. Now, it may not be the robust recruiting that you do for a month to fill a position for a salesperson where you're filling sales positions all the time, where you don't have an immediate need. It may be a quick post something and have people respond within a week or 2 weeks, but at least do some outreach, even for those positions that need to be immediately filled. The FCC has also recognized there are certain specialized positions, um, specialized positions where posting a local notice on a monster.com or a jobs.com in your local market may not find that meteorologist that you need for your TV station, or that AM engineer who you need to take care of that 5-tower clear channel array for your AM radio station. In that case, the wide dissemination can be through specialized recruiting, through meteorologist magazines or AM engineering job boards that may be nationwide rather than local, but you still do need to do that outreach. Another place where outreach does not apply is for an internal promotion. So you take a salesperson and promote the salesperson to sales manager. You can do that without any sort of wide dissemination to fill the sales manager position. Why? Because the FCC figures, well, you now have an opening in the sales department. You'll be filling that through wide dissemination. So if it's an advancement to another internal promotion, an advancement to a higher position at the station, you don't need to widely disseminate that for an employee that's been internally promoted, if that's a full-time employee who's been internally promoted. Now, part-timers and temporary employees are slightly different from this internal promotion. Technically, you don't need to go out and widely disseminate information about job openings for part-timers or temps at your station, but there are advantages for doing so. If you go out and widely disseminate before you hire a part-time employee, excuse me, you can advance them to a full-time position without widely disseminating again. It's essentially an internal promotion. You take them from a part-timer, move them to a full-time position, do it without wide dissemination if you filled that part-time position through wide dissemination. If instead you hired your brother-in-law's son for that part-time position, or the kid who cuts your lawn, or some relative of one of your other employees, or just some guy who walked through the front door is hired for that part-time position, and you haven't done wide dissemination, and that person turns out to be a super employee, you can't promote them to a full-time position without first doing wide dissemination for that full-time position. So there's advantages to using wide dissemination to fill those part-time employees positions. There's also no additional recruiting necessary if you've got a pool for which you widely disseminated of current employees who are already, or potential employees who you've already got their resumes or their job applications. Where does that usually come up? Sales employees. You go out to hire a new account exec. You go out and do wide dissemination. You get a pool of 10 different job applicants. You interview 5 of them. You decide applicant number 1 is the one that you're going to hire, and then somebody else quits in the sales department. Within 90 days or so, those job applications that you got during the first pool are probably still out there looking for jobs, or at least a good number of them are. You can call applicants 2, 3, or 4 to see if one of them will take that second opening, if your wide dissemination is no older than probably about 90 days, if the people are likely still out there looking for jobs. The FCC also says now that you can use online recruiting sources as your sole sources if you want to. In the past, the FCC had said until about 2017, I believe, that you had to use physical sources. You had to reach out to colleges, you had to reach out to employment agencies, you had to reach out to community organizations, you had to reach out to other sources of likely employees, religious organizations, fraternal organizations, whoever would be likely to refer employees. You had to actually send them letters or send them some sort of documentation asking them to send you potential employees. Don't have to do that anymore if you've got sources like a monster.com, a jobs.com, some sort of big online job source that everybody in your market uses to find jobs. Now, you've got to make sure that those sources are actually bringing in diverse employees from throughout your community, that they're not just bringing people who are already in the broadcast industry looking for jobs at your station, that they're actually bringing in new people for jobs at the station. So look at those people that you're interviewing. Look at the people that you're hiring. If they're all people that are already in the broadcast industry, you probably need to find some other recruitment sources to get people to apply for those jobs. So you have to, if you're not getting it through an online source, you probably have to go back to those old traditional sources, reaching out to schools, colleges, and high schools within your area, reaching out to employment agencies, reaching out to community groups, reaching out to minority organizations, reaching out to religious organizations, fraternal organizations within your community, veterans organizations, to see if they've got people who they can refer to you. And I see somebody ask the question, well, what about if nobody applies for jobs? That means that the FCC is going to see that as requiring you to expand your job outreach sources. If you're not getting applicants outside word of mouth, the FCC is going to say that you're not using proper wide dissemination. You just need to keep expanding those sources that you're using to reach out to more and more people to try to get them to apply for jobs at your stations. That's the way the FCC is going to look at it if you've just got all your employees and all your interviewees coming from word of mouth or referrals from your job sources. How can we control who applies for a position when widely disseminating? I assume that means how can you find out what source they're using in the interview process? First question you ask is, how did you find out about this job opening? That gives you the information about whether it's coming from, hey, my Uncle Joe who works at the station referred me uh, to you to apply for this job, or hey, I saw it posted on jobs.com and that's how I decided to apply. Or I saw it posted at the local employment agency, or I saw it posted in the help wanted ads at my university recruitment office, or on the church bulletin board, or wherever people go to look for jobs in your community. So even though the FCC has allowed stations to just use online sources, they still have fined people who haven't kept records of where the potential employees came from that they interviewed and hired, and for not looking at where those employees came from and seeing that they were not coming from diverse sources and expanding those sources. Now that's prong one, the requirement that for all your full-time job openings, you got to let the world know that you've got a job opening so that new recruits come in that you can interview and hopefully start hiring some of those. There's an additional requirement for dissemination, which is the prong two, that you've got to give notice to community groups who ask to be informed about job openings. Now, you can choose whether you send them a letter or send them an email, give them a call about job openings, but you've got to give notice to all the people, all these community groups who ask to be informed about job openings. And you've got to publicize the fact that community groups can be um, put on this list to find out about your job openings. How do you advertise that? Run an announcement on the air once a week or so in rotating time periods that said, hey, if you represent a community group in our service area that's active in employment matters and have potential employees who might be interested in working in broadcasting, send your group's name to this person at the station. We'll put you on our list and contact you when we've got a job opening. I'll run that announcement once a week in different time periods to let people know, let community groups know that they can get notices about job openings. They're on that list until they tell you to take me off that list. You can ask them every year or so, hey, do you still want to be on that list? But if they say yes, keep them on that list. And the FCC has fined stations who have identified community groups who want to be on the list and not sent them notices about job openings when those job openings have come about. A question I often get when I talk about this prong 2 requirement is who's a community group? How do I tell whether somebody is a real community group or not? My response is, who cares? If they say they're a community group and they actually refer potential employees to you, consider them a community group. Send them a notice. How can it hurt? You're just going to get more referrals, which is a good thing because you want to be expanding the sources from which you get referrals for employment positions to fill employment positions at your station. So prong 3 has nothing to do with whether you've got a job opening at your station. Instead, prong 3 has to do with your obligation as a broadcaster to go out and tell the community how they can find out about job openings in broadcast stations, what the qualifications are for job openings, what those jobs are at a broadcast station, to try to interest people in the community in getting into broadcast employment. And also, once you're in broadcast employment, how to advance those people within the broadcast workforce for more advanced positions within that workforce. So what the FCC has done is come up with 16 menu options, and stations have to meet a certain number of these menu options in every 2-year period. And that's 2 years from the date of the filing of your license renewal. They look at it in 2-year chunks. Employment units with 5 to 10 full-time employees must do at least 2 activities in every 2-year period. Employment units in smaller markets, markets of less than 250,000 people in a metropolitan area, only have to do 2 of these outreach efforts in every 2 years, or get 2 full credits in every year. And we'll talk about the credits on the next slide. Employment units in larger markets, those with more than 250,000 people in your metropolitan area. If you've got 11 or more full-time employees in your employment unit, you must do at least 4 of these activities in every 2-year period. Now, this is the one area that the FCC has not been real active in finding people yet. But in the recent renewal cycle, there were lots and lots of questions asked by the FCC's EEO branch about some of the menu options that were identified, some of the activities that were identified by broadcasters in their annual employment reports as meeting this requirement for menu options. So I say go out and do more than 2 if you're in a small market or have fewer than 11 full-time employees. Do more than is required because it's unclear exactly what will qualify for these outreach efforts. The FCC has said just spending money or running a couple of on-air promotions is not enough to meet the requirements of these menu options. There's got to be a substantial, significant effort on behalf of your station employees in order to get EEO credit for these activities. So again, there's a lot of subjectivity there. So it's unclear exactly when you get these credits. So do more than the absolute minimum. So what do you need to get a credit to the 2 credits for the small market stations or the small stations in a big market, or the 4 credits that those big market, larger cluster stations have to meet in a two-year period? Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. Participating in 4 job fairs within that 2-year period will get you 1 credit. To get that credit, employees who are involved in the employment process, supervisory employees from your station, have to go to those job fairs. You can't just send a secretary. Sorry. Just give me a moment here. I'm trying to get my voice back. You can't just send a secretary. It's got to be somebody who is actually involved in the employment process who goes to those job fairs. Co-sponsoring a job fair with a business or professional group with substantial minority or female membership, which is going to be most community organizations, will give you credit. Co-sponsoring doesn't just mean giving you some money and running some ads. You've got to participate in advertising, developing the advertising, developing the outreach, helping set up the job fair, making sure that you're getting people to come to the job fair, making sure that you're getting broadcasters or employers at the job fair. You've got to have people participating in a significant way in doing all that in order to get that 1 full credit for hosting a job fair or co-hosting a job fair. Doing activities sponsored by community groups active in employment issues, career days, conventions, workshops, going to your Chamber of Commerce and talking to them about how to get job openings, going to a Chamber of Commerce career day, talking to people about how to get positions at broadcast stations or what you need to qualify in for those broadcast stations. Do 4 of those activities in a 2-year period and you get credits, get 1 full credit. And note that you can mix and match. So you do 2 participations in activities by community groups and go to 2 job fairs, that gives you 1 credit. You get essentially a quarter credit for each one that you do. Running a scholarship program for folks that are interested in broadcast careers, where you're actually running the program, looking at the applicants, publicizing, developing a publicity campaign to make sure that you're getting applicants, going out and fundraising to make sure that you've got money to fund that scholarship program, not just running advertisements, not just giving $100 to the scholarship program, but actually helping to run that program. That gives you a full credit. Internship programs, high school, college interns who come in and spend a couple of weeks at your station following your employees, learning the ropes at a broadcast station. Each of those interns will give you a full credit. 4 activities by educational institutions relating to broadcast employment. This is another one. Each activity gets you a quarter of a credit. That means going to schools, colleges, high schools, elementary schools, telling people about job openings at broadcast stations, how to find out about those job openings, what the jobs are at a broadcast station, those sorts of things. Sponsoring community activities to educate the public on broadcast employment. Having an open house at your station where you bring people through and tell them what each employee does at a broadcast station, what kind of jobs there are at a broadcast station, getting people interested in that those jobs at a broadcast station, hosting Boy Scout troops. To get a merit badge in media and communications, they have to visit a broadcast station or other media outlet in their community. A great way to get some of that credit. Training programs to advance employee skills, not training salespeople to be salespeople, but training salespeople to be management employees, or training clerical employees to become a salesperson at the station, or training a clerical employee to become an on-air person, or training a junior technician to become a station engineer. Those training programs to advance employee skills gives you one full credit. EEO training programs for management employees. Hey, what are you doing right now? You're involved in a training program for management employees about EEO issues. Take these slides, and I'll be sending them to Wendy in Minnesota and to Allison in Kansas to distribute to all the folks who are on this call. Talk to the other folks involved in the hiring process at your station about the FCC requirements. And then next year, have a local employment lawyer come in and talk about local employment issues, about avoiding discriminatory practices at your stations and other EEO issues that can arise at your station. Have them talk to all your management employees, and you've developed an EEO training program for management employees. Training programs for nonprofit organizations on broadcast employment opportunities. Develop a training program for your local college or university, or for the state association to train people for broadcast activities. Any of these menu options, anything else that you do that are calculated to get people interested in applying for broadcast jobs, to telling people about what broadcast jobs are all about, what opportunities are available in the broadcast industry, anything that's done with that design in mind, that has a substantial activities by your employees, more than just a email, or more than just running some announcements, or more than just donating a couple $100, but actual time, significant time commitments from your people in ways to educate your community about broadcast employment opportunities, count for these menu options. Again, even if you've got no openings at your station, you've got the same 5 full-time employees that never change, you still have to engage in activities to educate your community about broadcast employment opportunities, fulfill these menu options. So that's the 3 prongs of the FCC's EEO requirements. Now we're winding down with what you need to do after you've done all this outreach. The first thing we've already talked about, but it's an actual requirement of the FCC's rules: self-assessment, going through all those outreach activities and making sure that they're really bringing in a diverse workforce. They're really bringing in people who are applying, who are interviewed, who are hired for jobs from outside that old boys network, from outside of word of mouth, from outside of consultant referrals, from outside of internal corporate referrals that bring new people into the broadcast industry. Analyze your recruitment. And if you haven't gotten enough people from outside that old boys network, expand your recruitment efforts. Somebody said, well, nobody ever applies for those jobs. Keep expanding it so that over that 2-year period, you can show the FCC that, hey, we didn't get a whole lot of referrals, a whole lot of interest from outside groups in the first 2 jobs we had within that year. So the 3rd job, we added 3 more recruitment sources. We still didn't get it. We added 3 more for the next job. That you're still trying. You're expanding your outreach efforts. Also review all the other employment practices at your stations, seniority practices, salaries and benefits. Make sure that you're not discriminating unintentionally or intentionally, obviously, but unintentionally at your station in any way that could get you into trouble with any other employment agency. So what paperwork do you have to keep? This is the key to staying out of trouble with the FCC, because generally most broadcasters, I find, can meet these other requirements. They can go out and widely disseminate. They can find stuff for the menu options. But where stations routinely get into trouble is they just don't keep records about what they did. For your internal station records, keep records of all the jobs that you filled. Figure out and keep records of all the recruitment sources that you used for your wide dissemination for any of those employment, for every one of those positions that you've tried to fill. When you get an audit notice, the FCC will ask for each job opening that you had in the prior 2 years, what recruitment source did you use for each of those job openings? So you need that information. You need the address, telephone number, and a contact person at each of the recruitment sources. You need dated copies of correspondence or emails to all of the recruitment sources telling them that you've got a job opening. You need to keep track of the number of interviewees for each job and the recruitment source for each of those interviewees, the recruitment source of the person hired, the total number of interviewees during the year, and that's December to December for Minnesota, February to February for Kansas. The total number of interviewees during the year broken down by the recruitment source used. So I got so many from jobs.com. I got so many from broadcast announcements about our job openings. I got so many from the local employment agency. I got so many from the recruiting office at the local college. How many interviewees came from each of those recruitment sources as a total during the year, and then documentation for all the supplemental efforts, all these menu options, letters from the Boy Scout troops, or if there's no letters from the Boy Scout troops or the high school class that you went to talk to, or the Chamber of Commerce luncheon that you spoke at, or whatever activity that you did, keep notes, dated notes that you've got. Hey, on such and such a date, our station engineer went to talk to a technical class at the local technical high school about careers in broadcasting or what a broadcast engineer does. Keep those notes so that you've got documentation of all the supplemental efforts. You take that documentation and you whittle it down for your public inspection file report. The public inspection file report lists all the full-time jobs that you filled in the prior year, again, February to February for Kansas, December to December for Minnesota. The list of all the full-time jobs that you filled by job title, We filled an account exec position. We filled a broadcast announcer position. We filled a position for a meteorologist on our TV station. We filled a position for a clerical employee. The recruitment sources used to fill jobs, all the jobs, the address, telephone number, and contact person for each of those recruitment sources needs to be listed on this public file report. The recruitment source of the person hired, we had an account exec. We filled that position through a referral from jobs.com. The total number of interviewees during the year, it doesn't have to be broken down by job, but the total number of interviewees for the entire February to February or December to December period, broken down by the recruitment source. So in that year, we filled 4 positions. The total number of interviewees for all 4 positions was 18. 12 came from jobs.com, 2 came from the local high school, 2 came from word of mouth, 1 came from the local college, and 1 came from some community group who referred them to us. So that's where our interviewees came from. A description of all the supplemental efforts. A couple of sentences about your engineer talked to the local high school. You sent your HR person to the job fairs, whatever the supplemental efforts were, got to put a couple of sentences so that the FCC can see by looking at your annual report that there was some significant staff time involved in those efforts. Now I get this question, what form do I use to fill that out? I can't find a form on the FCC's website to fill that out. There's no form. You create your own form that has all this information in it and put that form into your public inspection file by February 1 for all the stations in Kansas, by December 1 for all the stations in Minnesota. Annual uploading requirement, upload it by the anniversary of your renewal filing, February 1 for Kansas, December 1 for Minnesota. It stays in that public inspection file until the next license renewal is granted. So by the end of the license renewal term, you'll have 8 annual EEO public inspection file reports sitting there in your online public inspection file. Don't take them down, leave them up there. The most recent EEO public inspection file report, you need a link on your station's website. Each of your stations within the employment unit, a link to the uploaded report for that employment unit on the public inspection file. So somebody coming to your WXYZ homepage to look at music will somewhere see EEO public inspection file report linked there on that homepage that they can click on. And the FCC checks these homepages. Midterm reports, they're checking your EEO links on your website. License renewal for TV, they're going through your online public inspection file report. Technically speaking, you can end your reporting period 10 days before that February or December 1 report so that you've got a couple of days to put the report together. That's based on when you're actually hiring the person. So if you've got a job recruitment in action, but you haven't hired the person by February 1 or by December 1, that's going to go in the next report. How long should these EEO reports be retained in the online public inspection file? As I said, for a full license renewal term until that end of that 8-year license term. So that basically describes the FCC's EEO requirements. Where do stations get in trouble? Discrimination, actual discrimination, triggers an FCC review. They'll ask all sorts of questions. You can have problems at license renewal time. Insufficient outreach, not doing that wide dissemination, not bringing in people from outside that old boys network that can get you into trouble. Failing to document your efforts or your problems, not doing that self-analysis of what you've been doing to see whether you need additional outreach, it's going to get you into trouble. Not doing these supplemental menu options, it's going to get you into trouble. Not keeping the paperwork, not keeping the paperwork, not keeping the paperwork is going to get you into trouble. Make sure that you do the FCC filings. And then lastly, make sure that whatever you say on any of these FCC documents, whether it's documents for the public file or documents filed at the FCC, don't overstate what you did. Play it by the book. Say exactly what you did. Describe it accurately. Because overstating or trying to make stuff up that you didn't really do can get you into trouble. If the FCC thinks you're lying, that's the worst thing that you can possibly do. Because not doing some of this outreach effort, yeah, you could get fined. And if you've had past violations, there was a recent case where a broadcaster who had a couple of small EEO problems in the past at unrelated stations forgot one annual public inspection file report, got uploaded 9 months late, license renewal time. That broadcaster got fined over $30,000 because they had past problems with their EEO reports. But generally, the fine for just messing up some of these things once is going to be a couple $1,000s. Fine for looking like you're lying can not only be a huge fine, but could actually end up losing your license. So play it straight. Don't make stuff up that you didn't do. So are all the reporting requirements for full-time jobs? Yes, they are. All those requirements that we just talked about were for full-time jobs, but certainly if you're going to rely on the promotion of a part-timer to a full-time position, make sure you keep some records that shows that you widely disseminated for that part-time position in case anybody ever says, hey, you took that part-timer and hired them for a full-time position, but you didn't widely disseminate that full-time position. You can say, I didn't have to. I widely disseminated for the part-time position. Here's my proof. So that's the FCC's EEO Public Inspection File Report. There's my contact information. I'm the hotline attorney for both Kansas and Minnesota. So if you've got easy questions about some of these issues, I'm happy to answer them. Also, my commercial. I write a blog, the Broadcast Law blog, that covers some of these issues on a routine basis. We also do a weekly summary that we post on Sunday, and usually Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, that summarizes all the regulatory issues that happened in the previous week at the FCC. Might be worth checking out just so that you can stay on top of your FCC obligations in EEO and every place else. Thanks very much for listening this afternoon. Hopefully this was helpful.
David, and we'll be sending the slide deck and the letter for your file by end of business tomorrow. So thanks, everyone. Thanks again, David. That was great.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, all.